Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
Hello, everybody. It's the 11th of November. Apologies for being a few minutes late. There's also a new time for us as due to daylight savings in the United States. Don't know why that exists. We never figured it out in the rest of the world. But so it is. And welcome back. This is the 101st episode of Give the People What They Want, brought to you by People's Dispatch. That's Zoe and I. And Globetrotter, Vijay from Globetrotter will be joining us shortly and will be bringing a set of stories as well. Of course, a very eventful week right now. We're talking, of course, about time when COP27 is going on that has dominated news stories. We'll be talking about that. Midterm elections in the United States causing, a lot of discussion. We're weeks away from, 10 days or so away from one of the biggest sporting events in the world. We'll be talking about that as well. But I'd like to start with an issue which got also a fair deal of attention, which was the peace deal in Ethiopia. And now on the show, you know that we talked about Ethiopia quite a bit, talking about the conflict that took place over the past 2 years. It's in November 2020, this very month, 2 years ago, that this war broke out as well between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Now, there's a long back history to that. The TPLF, of course, was the organization which ruled Ethiopia for nearly 27 years, starting from the 90s. A very autocratic rule, and it was this TPLF which was dislodged by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and a protest movement in 2018 as well. So we do know that last year they launched an assault. There was a lot of warfare, a very dire humanitarian crisis that took place in the whole of Ethiopia as well. We do know that ceasefires were declared at various points, which the TPLF broke, and finally, with the mediation of the African Union, a peace deal was finally signed in Pretoria in South Africa at the beginning of the month. Now, very, very important peace deal. Quite a couple of things I think we need to sort of take from this deal. One, of course, being the fact that a lot depends on this deal. And, there are many people who are carefully watching to see if this deal will be honored, because what are some of the key aspects of this deal? One talks about the complete disarmament of the TPLF by the early part of the first 2 weeks of December or so. It talks about the TPLF being integrated into the political and governmental institutions of Ethiopia. It talks about the constitution, of paying priority to the constitutional order again. It talks about the fact that the Ethiopian Defense Forces will be the sole military force. So many analysts have sort of even explained this or talked about this as, in some senses, a surrender of the TPLF almost, because the TPLF did suffer very major military setbacks, especially towards the end of the fighting in October. So, a lot of eyes on whether this conflict will hold. We've seen various previous ceasefires not working out, and this peace agreement is of vital importance if humanitarian supplies are to resume properly, if Ethiopia needs to sort of get back on its feet. But two other conclusions I'd like to sort of draw your attention to, point out. One being the fact that this was an African Union mediated process. Now, we do know that the TPLF tried very hard to bring the US and the EU in a very central position in these negotiations. The US was still there as an observer and participant, of course, but the TPLF wanted the US and the EU definitely to play a more central role. That did not take place. This process, I think, is very good for the fact that bodies like the African Union emerge as significant and important players and contenders which can actually resolve conflicts in the region, because there is a tendency to sort of reduce the power of these agencies. Western countries often want to intervene and push their own agenda, which the US did try to do, of course, and has done. But nonetheless, the fact that this was an AU mediated process brings a lot of is one very positive thing. Secondly, the fact, of course, is that this deal, if it works out, would be very good for the Horn of Africa region. It would mean a greater amount. It opens the possibility of a greater amount of collaboration between the countries in the region. We know the Horn of Africa extremely important strategically to the world because of its location, but also countries in this region have faced a huge amount of conflict. For instance, we've been hearing about the famine in Somalia, which has had very devastating consequences. We'll probably talk about that in the next week's show. But because of foreign intervention has played a very key role in actually accentuating some of these conflicts, including the fact that the U.S. supported the TPLF in the during its 27 rule. That also played a huge role in it. So there is really the hope that that this peace deal would sort of help the countries in the Horn of Africa to sort of come together to work a bit more closely to sort of bring to bring cooperation, to increase cooperation among themselves and engage with the outside world in that way. So fingers crossed, as they say, because this deal, if it does not hold, it could have even worse consequences for the people of that very embattled country and who have faced nearly 2 years of conflict. So very important story to keep watching, and we will be doing that. Our colleague Pawan already has a very detailed breakdown of this peace agreement and various arguments about it on People's Dispatch. Please do read it. So important issue to look forward to.
Yeah, it's so crucial to be paying attention to this, especially because of the geopolitical importance. Of course, the United States finds Ethiopia of a lot of interest, which is why they've invested so much in sabotaging the peace and sabotaging the region. So I'm glad that we're continuing to follow this with a lot of care. On the other side of, as we love to bounce around, this past week was also the 2-year anniversary of when Luis Arce, the president of Bolivia, took office. At People's Dispatch, we were lucky enough to cover his historic election where he won in the first round of the elections in October 2020 against Carlos Mesa, who was the candidate of the far right. This was a historic election. Of course, elections that took place after a brutal and violent military coup against democratically elected president Evo Morales, and it saw the Bolivian people on the streets for a year, really, to demand a return to democracy, demand these elections wherein Luis Arce was elected. So it's so symbolic and so important. These 2 years that he's been in office, he's really worked to reverse a lot of the negative impacts that took place during the coup, the 1 year of coup government, where they essentially just attempted to sabotage all national industries, huge corruption schemes taking place. And of course, Luis Arce, as an economist, his primary specialty is really strengthening the state economy, working for integrating community cooperatives and many different structures into the national economy. And so this is super important, these 2 years of government. However, they're taking place in the middle of kind of a difficult situation in Bolivia, in the department of Santa Cruz, which, if people were following the coup in 2019, then they would have remembered that Santa Cruz was kind of the hub of a lot of the anti-democratic activities that were taking place before and after the elections. They really were kind of the primary pushers of this anti-democratic narrative, saying that fraud was committed, and also the concentration of a lot of these shock groups, as they call them in Bolivia, which are these fascist groups, armed groups that erected road blockades, that were the people that were responsible for the fascist attacks against members of the Movement Towards Socialist Party. So this is, once again, Santa Cruz is the center of new pre-coup efforts. For the past couple of weeks, they've been mobilizing in kind of what seems like quite a random demand, which is that the census that's going to be taking place in the year 2024, that it should take place in 2023. This demand has been essentially taken up by these groups in Santa Cruz, who are led by Luis Fernando Camacho, who was primary behind the coup efforts in 2019. He's now the governor of Santa Cruz, even though he's also been accused of many crimes and of inciting these protests, of inciting violence, etc. Continues to be the governor, and he's once again riling people behind this demand that the census should be carried out in 2023. And this is, again, I'm sure he has his arguments, but this is essentially the reason that he's attempted to bring the department to a standstill, not engaging in any negotiations. They've really caused a lot of havoc, and the national government has attempted to call dialogue tables, has attempted to kind of bring them to discussion. And there's been some efforts that have taken place, but they've rejected many of them. and have just continued to be blocking work from happening. And there's been a lot of confrontation between people who want to be going to work and going about their daily lives, and these shock groups, which are impeding the daily economy and their daily lives from taking place. And so this is entering, I think, the third week of these protests. The Bolivian government has called on them to kind of back down and engage in dialogue. And of course, these protests, while about the census, of course, have a political motivation, which is destabilizing the government, destabilizing the Mass Party, destabilizing Luis Arce. So we've been following this at People's Dispatch. We'll continue. I also recommend people follow Kasasha News, a very good news source in English about Bolivia. They've been also following this very closely. But it's very important to remember, I think this is a key element, is that once a progressive government gets elected, it continues to be a struggle. And those far-right forces that we're seeing grow across the continent, and especially now with the victory of Lula da Silva, continue to be there, and they continue to reinvent new strategies to destabilize and try to push their agenda in any way possible.
Right, so yeah, it's a very important point you actually ended with, because you talked about how the right wing, which is in many cases has often been backed by Western powers, they prevent the progress or the functioning of democratic governments, or progressive governments especially. And this is all the more important because the tasks before such governments are the tasks progressive governments set for themselves are of such vital importance, ending issues like hunger, ending issues like poverty, malnutrition, trying to work on education, and very equally trying to work on climate change as well. And this is been all the more significant now because COP27 is going on right now. On the one hand, we've seen leaders from across the world come and talk at many of these sessions. We have seen interesting proposals from Nicolas Maduro, for instance, a very important intervention by Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados. I believe Gustavo Petro from Colombia has also delivered a very important speech. It's very important, I think, to sort of listen to the proposals of many of these leaders, because they bring, especially progressive governments, because they bring something which often governments of the West or of the global North do not bring. And I think, which is why it's equally important to sort of focus on the COP27 as well. It's a very difficult topic to follow. Let's be even for me, to be honest, because however much you read, there's this avalanche of information that keeps coming in that's often distracting. A lot of bad news, which is very important. But also within these reports, also within these discussions, are fundamental questions of justice of our time. And I think these need to be flagged again and again. Right now, the COP27 summit going on, again, this question of justice very much on the table. Global countries of the global South are consistently pushing for the countries, pushing countries of the global North to honor the promises they made regarding financing, regarding money, because historically we do know that the global North is responsible for the bulk of the carbon emissions which are leading to climate change, which are likely to make the situation worse. And so it is only right that they also provide the funding that is necessary to to not only to mitigate the effects, but also to deal with it right now, because climate change is not just an issue of the future, 30 years or 50 years from now. It's today's issue. And I think right now, technical discussions going on. For the first time, loss and damage has become an agenda point in this meeting. It's a term you're going to be hearing a lot in the coming months and years as well. It basically means that countries which are now suffering the brunt of climate change be able to receive the kind of funding that is needed to actually deal with that impact. And it was fittingly introduced on behalf of G77 in China by Pakistan, which endured a horrible bout of flooding this year, and people have attributed that to climate change. So I think this has been the demand, and what we've seen is basically that the Western countries, they have sort of been very reluctant to commit to actually providing finances. That's point number one. They have failed to honor their pledges. The pledge was that $100 billion a year would be allocated every year. That hasn't happened. And even some of the promises have turned out to be inflated promises. Whatever they said they're committing, they've turned out to be inflated. Equally importantly, the fact that a lot of this money is in the form of debt or it's insurance based. So what we have is the possibility that countries in the global south, for instance, countries in Africa, in order to combat climate change, will end up further in debt. And how this is a sustainable or just, or it defies your imagination to think that after all this has happened, now countries have to go further into debt to deal with the crisis which others are largely responsible for. So there's a very strong push from the global south on all these issues, on clear financial commitments, on mechanisms to deliver it, on non-debt based finance for climate related issues as well. And all these are going to be played out right now. The technical talks are on, but we do know that there's going to be more political discussions in the coming weeks as well. Our colleague Tarapriya has been very closely following these issues, so do check out her stories on People's Dispatch. We just have one that was put up today on the finance related discussions. And of course, we talked about this before, and I believe Zoe is going to talk about it now as well, because countries, island nations, are some of the worst affected. We talked about it. We saw this last year as well, when strong appeals were put forward regarding the survival. So yeah,
that's exactly right. And I think really picking off this importance of loss and damage, and this being brought up in this COP in Egypt is crucial. And one of the biggest proponents of this, as you said, Pakistan was the one that brought this to the table in the G77 plus, but also has been the Alliance of Small Island States. This group, which is made up of small islands from across the world. If you look at the map of membership, it's essentially all the little dots that you see across the world. They're members of this group, including the Bahamas, Antigua and Barbuda, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Seychelles. All of these places, actually, which I think is quite ironic, where the rich and powerful go for their vacations, are the same countries which are demanding that the rich and powerful take responsibility for the damage that they've done to the earth and to the climate. These are countries which have such a minuscule impact on climate change in terms of actual numbers of carbon emission, of the impact on so many of these aspects. Yet they are, as you mentioned, the most impacted. Some of these places like Tuvalu, for example, are essentially seeing their homes disappear and be eaten by the ocean. With the rising of the sea levels, a lot of these places are disappearing. And this, of course, means that people's homes are disappearing. They don't have anywhere to go. And so this becomes, well, for some countries, maybe they're seeing more storms, maybe they're seeing more rainfall. For these places, it's a matter of life and death and of survival. And so they've been extremely adamant. In Glasgow, there's a pretty large civil society delegation of these small islands. I think once again, they gave a really rousing address to this COP27 Sharm el-Sheikh, demanding once again that loss and damage be taken seriously, and that for these small islands, it's really, it has to be taken seriously. They really have no other option. And it's impressive to see this unity that they're able to build. And a lot of these places, don't even have a, what leftists would say, an anti-capitalist approach to talking about climate change and saying that it's, the fall of capitalism. But so many people are seeing that more and more. The global north, you can't deny the numbers. These societies that consume and consume and consume and don't.
Did we lose Zoe also there? I believe we did. Right. So yes, just picking up from where Zoe left, a very important story to sort of follow as well, because for some of these island nations, the time is very, very less. In fact, one of the key studies that came out after just before the COP27 summit said that with the current nature of pledges, we are not going to meet the target of 1.5 degrees, that is limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees before pre-industrial levels. According to the current targets, we are looking at a 2.5 degree increase by the end of the century. Now, this could just completely alter the geography of the world. It could alter human civilization as we've known it for hundreds of years, if not thousands, because the impact on agriculture, the impact on fishing, the impact on urban life, for instance. Everything is going to be it's going to be horrendous. So time really is running short for us, and it's it's kind of important to keep tuning into these discussions, because like I think we talked about in the show last time as well, it's not just about numbers and technicalities and claims and counterclaims. It's really about our very survival. And we're moving on to our next story. We're talking about, incidentally, again, in some ways connected to the COP27 discussion. It's about Pakistan, which, like I said, suffered, some massive floods just a few months ago. The situation there still remains very, very delicate. Millions were displaced at that point of time. It's going to take a long time for people to recover. The health conditions situation there is pretty bad as well. The fears of outbreaks of various diseases. Health activists warning about that. Meanwhile, there seems to be a political crisis of a completely, which has gained all the attention there. And this, of course, starting from the fact that former Prime Minister Imran Khan, who was overthrown during no confidence motion in April, with all his opponents ganging up together, launched towards the end of October a rally to the capital, Islamabad. Now, we do know that Imran Khan, especially because of the way in which he was overthrown and all his opponents combined, and because of the perception that the military was also backing his opponents, Imran Khan suddenly has become, not suddenly, I would say, but has become an extremely popular figure in Pakistan as an anti-establishment, lone wolf crusader kind of a character. It's ironic considering the fact that he himself rose because of the backing of the military. But right now he's emerged as, this kind of heroic figure who's, resisting everyone single-handedly. And it has also been helped by the fact that after he left, the economic situation has worsened much, much more. I think now the inflation is in the late 20s, which is quite shocking. And considering already the kind of crisis they're facing, the current government, the dispensation has no real options but to go around with a begging bowl. But even that is only working to a limited extent. And now this gives Imran Khan an excellent opportunity. He took out a rally. There was an assassination attempt against him. And he got injured on his leg. A worker of his party was killed in the incident. And he, of course, like Taimur Rahman, who we interviewed on this issue, will be publishing that shortly, pointed out that in the immediate aftermath, his popularity is actually increased, especially because of the fact that the impression created when he got up from there and got back to his car, waved, etc. So right now we're looking at the possibility of a bit of a political deadlock in Pakistan, because while Imran Khan does not is not in power, nonetheless the fact remains that in power at the national level at least, nonetheless the fact remains that he's been able to mobilize a huge number of people, and he's emerged as an anti-systemic voice. And this gives him huge opportunity to sort of push back against the military and the establishment, which have been the traditional establishment of Pakistan. So Imran Khan's demand, of course, is that elections be held immediately. Now, of course, the establishment does not want that because they're worried about losing the elections because of the way they've not been able to handle the economic crisis. But the important thing to note, of course, here is that both sides don't really have too much of a solution to deal with the systemic crisis Pakistan has been facing. Both sides have opted to go for the IMF, which is not really any kind of solution, as we've talked about often on this show. There's been no real sustained attempt to improve productivity, either at agricultural level or at an industrial level. So Pakistan, unfortunately, just like its neighbor Sri Lanka, just like many other countries we talked about, lurching from crisis to crisis, compounded by the impact of issues like climate change, left with very little wriggle room on a fiscal basis to implement any radical policies at all. And so going into this same vicious cycle where they have limited scope, they undertake policies which worsen the condition of the people. The people get increasingly angry. A new anti-systemic challenger emerges, and you end up doing the same kind of policies. So that's unfortunately in many countries become a cycle which needs to be. The question, of course, before activists, before militants, is how to break that cycle, as they say. And difficult times for the people of Pakistan, and we need to see what's going to happen in the coming weeks and months. The rally continues, Imran Khan likely to start more more mass gatherings and rallies. So do keep your eyes on Pakistan as well, because it's illustrative about what is likely to happen in many other parts of the world as well.
Well, as we promised, we're now going to get to the most important sporting event, as you said, Prashant, in the world. I guess that's true. Even though I don't.
Depends on which country you're asking.
Depends which country you're asking. Sitting from India, maybe it's actually, that's not true. It's definitely very important in India. Well, we're talking about the World Cup, and it kicks off on November 20th. Extremely exciting for most of the world that will follow their teams. It starts with a game, Qatar versus Ecuador. And this is an interesting World Cup, as all of them are, because this one specifically has come under a lot of scrutiny because of the human rights situation in Qatar itself. Not only the overall human rights situation in Qatar, which for those of people who have been following is extremely dire, especially for the hundreds and thousands of migrants that live and work there under extremely horrific conditions. But in the preparation for this World Cup, which involved construction of massive stadiums and a lot of other infrastructure to receive what is the World Cup, not only building the stadiums for people to play football in, but of course, all of the rest which comes with it, there have been horrible working conditions. Hundreds of migrant workers have been killed in this process. A lot of football players themselves have actually come out and said, even leading up to this, that they didn't feel comfortable playing in Qatar. The Danish team, for example, wanted to have a jersey that said human rights for all, and FIFA actually banned them from doing this. They said this is not a universal message, and it's a big issue because people are coming there knowing the human cost that this World Cup has taken. FIFA, of course, is accused of many different things across the years, but I think that this World Cup specifically has really put them under a lot of fire because of the money that's going into all of this, the human rights violations that it's essentially giving a blind eye to. And then, of course, this will be a world spectacle, and all of these crimes will be forgotten. Of course, in the World Cup in Brazil, there were a lot of similar issues that were coming under the microscope in terms of the militarization of a lot of different cities, kind of the clearing of a lot of poor and homeless people in order to make way for the World Cup. And so these huge sporting events, every time they happen, do happen under these very complicated circumstances where there is a lot of human rights violations. But I think this one in Qatar is really going to take the cake. It's also going to present a series of new challenges. Usually the World Cup is played during the summer of the Northern Hemisphere, the winter of the Southern Hemisphere. This year, because of the climate conditions in Qatar, it had to be played during the winter because of the extreme heat. So that's also going to be an issue. Is it going to be okay conditions for people to play in a healthy way? This, of course, will continue to be an issue as climate change progresses, and many places across the world will essentially be uninhabitable for human existence. But we, of course, will be continuing to follow this. We know our colleague Prasanth from People's Dispatch and NewsClick is a great sports and politics commentator. So very, very excited to continue following this epic sporting event, which, of course, everything in life has political elements. Nothing is apolitical. So we'll, of course, be giving you the political perspective. Tell us a little about what the reaction of the people in Kerala has been to this World Cup. There are some pretty awesome images that we saw.
Yes, there have been cutouts of Neymar, Messi, and Cristiano Ronaldo, I believe, all placed right next to each other in a game of who's better than the rest. And yes, like you said, it's going to be, especially Kerala, definitely football fever is a huge thing. It's going to be one of the most widely watched events there. Many other states in India too. So yes, looking forward to that. But like you said, also equally important to follow some of these aspects which do not get talked about so often as as the main game does. And I think that's pretty much a metaphor for our show as well, because that's what we seek to do: on give the people what they want, bring you issues that are not talked about so much, or are talked about from a different perspective, and try to sort of give you a roundup of topics of news from each week that makes you think about the news itself, the world around you, and also it makes us think, definitely, because it makes us re-examine a lot of our assumptions every day. And so that's all we have for this week. It was great talking to all of you from People's Dispatch. That's Zoe and I, and Globetrotter. Vijay, of course, was not able to log in, but he'll definitely be here next week. So until then, goodbye, everybody, and see you next week.